Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today from London is Philip Stevens, chief political commentator at the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to have you. And from Washington, D.C., Nahal Toosi, who is a foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Nahal, great to have you back. And all the way from Berlin is Stefan Cornelius, political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, great to have you with us today as well. A lot of great news going around the world, but we have to focus first of all on what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian territories. An incredible eruption of violence, Stefan, both communal for the first time in a long time between Arabs and Israelis, citizens of Israel, and of course between Hamas in Gaza and the Israeli military forces. We'll talk about the larger implications of all of this in a minute, but Stefan, where did this come from? Why now, all of a sudden, such an incredible eruption of violence?
Well, I guess it's the perfect mix. We'll see. It's the perfect storm, a multi-level conflict which erupted almost a week ago on the convulsion of both religious holidays, secular holidays in Israel, the holiest night in Ramadan, sort of a tiny incident which started off in East Jerusalem, houses being emptied, Palestinian inhabitants thrown out, Israeli settlers, or actually landowners, trying to move into their property, a kind of a slow takeover of land, which basically was the final drop in that bucket. It's simply got too much. And the Hamas, and that's the next level, used that as a pretext to launch the heaviest attacks we have seen now for so many years. I think there are 119 dead Palestinians now, almost a dozen dead Israelis, rocket volleys on both sides, countless rockets flying day and night, talk of a ground offensive now in Gaza Strip. And both, and that's my final word, on both sides, the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, on the Hamas side, it serves the political leaders. Benjamin Netanyahu being voted out of office or unable to form a government, and the Hamas leadership being unable to be voted into government because the denial of an election there in the Palestinian territories. Both have a vested interest in steering trouble because it keeps them in power, or they can demonstrate their power. So we see the perfect storm.
Now, pick up on this last point, if you would, on sort of the domestic politics on both sides. Really, it almost seems like both sides needed this conflict for some political consolidation. I don't want to accuse either side of doing this for political reasons only, but certainly the politics provided part of the fuel to the fire. What is happening in Israel on the political side and on the Palestinian side?
Well, Israel had its fourth election in 2 years, and Benjamin Netanyahu came out sort of on top, but not top enough. He was unable to form a coalition government, however, and so it was falling to others to do this. But now the sense is that what has happened now, the conflagration, could actually boost him. He might be able to pull together enough parties, or there might be a fifth election, which means he continues to remain Prime Minister of Israel. And Bibi also faces legal problems, and so that's adding to part of his desire to stay in power. And then on the Palestinian side, they were supposed to have parliamentary and presidential elections for the first time in 15 years this year. But Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, decided to postpone them indefinitely, saying that he blamed Israel. He said he couldn't get guarantees that Palestinians in East Jerusalem would be able to vote. But the sense is that, he was actually worried that Hamas-linked candidates would do very well, and that Hamas would end up winning these elections. And Hamas was pretty upset that the elections have been postponed. And in the US, I think there was a certain measure of relief that that was something they weren't going to have to deal with, the idea of a Hamas-led government. But now, of course, we have this violence, and it's, to me, it's questionable how much Hamas is going to benefit from this. I think they think, well, we'll, fire rockets and point to the civilian casualties that happen as a result of Israel firing missiles back at us and gain sympathy and that sort of thing. But I also think there's a lot of frustration among some Palestinians and others that Hamas kind of took over the narrative here, because up until they started firing the rockets, the narrative had been very sympathetic to the Palestinians, especially the ones who faced eviction from their homes in East Jerusalem.
Philip, what's remarkable about this latest conflagration is this dual nature. Really, for the first time, we have almost 2,000 rockets being shot at Israel in large volleys to overcome the defenses and doing real damage. And so you have this long anticipated air war going on between Palestinians, Hamas in this case, and Israel on the one hand, and then these extraordinary events inside Israel itself, with Arabs and citizens of Israel and Israeli citizens of Israel setting after each other, with the prime minister saying that we need to stop the lynching on both sides. These are remarkable statements and remarkable developments leading to this violence. Is it really very different this time around than before, or is it just the latest in a cycle of violence that we've seen in this part of the world for so long? You're still muted, Philip.
Speaking to some of the European diplomats who've been directly involved this week in trying to, like everyone, broker some reduction in tension at least. I mean, one of them said to me, and I think this was very astute, that in a way this has punctured a lot of complacency that was building up in Israel and Palestine. That we haven't seen this sort of violence for many years. There's been a sense that the Arab-Israel problem has sort of gone away. We've seen the Abraham's Accords between Israel, some of the Arab states. And what's happened is that the pressure building up within Israel and in East Jerusalem and on the West Bank, and it has been building as Netanyahu's government has been pushing out settlements, allowing settler groups to push further into East Jerusalem. That pressure's been building up. And the other big point, Iran. I mean, Hamas can fire all these rockets because Iran has been supplying them. And if you stand back and look at the regional sort of perspective on this, the big winner from this is Iran. Because as I said, you've seen this rapprochement between Israel and some of the Arab states, talk that maybe even Saudi Arabia at some point might come round. What we now see is Arab states with their own street, out there for the Palestinians, Arab states having to pull back, and Iran looking stronger as a consequence. One, because it supplied Hamas with these rockets, which fire far deeper into Israel than they used to have. And the Arab states now feeling more detached from, pulling back from rapprochement with Israel. So, I think I think the Iranians played a big part in this, in encouraging Hamas. But I think the pressures building up in Israel have been ignored, and on the West Bank and in Gaza have been ignored for too long, both by the United States and by the Europeans.
Stefan, pick up on any of the 3 points that Philip makes on the long-term ignoring of the Israel-Palestine issue. You remember when Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, everybody thought this was going to light up the Palestinians. It didn't, but it has now. The Iranian angle, which is very important, and of course this the relationship that Israel was trying to build with its Arab friends while ignoring the Palestinians. All three now seem to be deeply problematical for the future of the region.
The big lesson we get out of this is that there's nothing marginal in this conflict. There's nothing too tiny to be ignored. Even small housing problems or housing disputes in East Jerusalem can lead to big flare-up. And so we're really went into the troubles when we started to ignore all these sort of tiny issues piling up to this larger fire we're now watching. And yeah, Philip said it better than I can ever do. I mean, this is benefiting Iran in its quest to get back into negotiations and onto the scene. This is benefiting the regional players, Netanyahu and Hamas. This is hurting the EU because it shows how weak, how hopeless the EU is in dealing with this problem. It also brings back President Biden into the game, who, from what I observed, was desperate not to be involved too fast. Now he cannot escape it. I mean, he has to, if he wants to show that he's capable of dealing with the major international issues. My number one take from this is that we cannot simply ignore the tiny bits of this problem because they will amass to a much larger one. And the most dangerous part of that week-long radicalization we've seen now is the inter-Israeli clash between the Israeli and Arab population and the Jewish population. It's actually a feature which will spill over in other countries as well. We do see it here in Europe. The French government just prohibited demonstrations, pro-Palestinian demonstrations. German politicians are out voicing concern about Palestinians or pro-Palestinian groups going to the streets. There were Israeli flags being burned in front of synagogues in Germany, a huge outrage, big fear of anti-Semitic fallback. So there is huge potential of further explosions in there.
Now, when you talk to your sources in Washington, I mean, clearly the Biden administration came to power hoping to be able to reduce its attention to the Middle East, to pivot to Asia, to use a phrase, and as Martin Indyk and others have said, you may ignore the Middle East, but the Middle East doesn't ignore you. Is the administration, you have a sense that they understand the seriousness of this and the need for the kind of engagement that we've seen past American administrations make to try to deal with both the small and the big issues that are out there?
I think they understand the seriousness, but I don't think that means that they're necessarily changing their overall plans to focus less on this issue. I think one reason I think that's because they haven't really staffed much on this topic. The person that they've just sent out there, Hadi Amr, a lot of people really like him, but he's only a deputy assistant secretary of state. You know, you would think in a crisis like this, you would send the deputy secretary of state at least, or someone higher ranking. President Biden has kept his involvement relatively minimal. I just think they feel like there's just not a lot to be gained. But one thing they are doing is they're really pushing regional governments to do more to try to bring this to an end. Part of the reason is because we don't talk to Hamas, we consider them a terrorist group, but countries like Qatar and others have connections with them. And so there's a lot of pressure for these other Arab governments in the region to step up and to try to bring this to an end. One other thing I want to say is I talked to several Trump administration officials who are deeply involved in their Mideast policy. And it's really fascinating to get their point of view on this, because they were arguing that, you know, the reason you didn't see this type of outbreak of violence during their time in power was because Trump made it very clear from the beginning, we were siding with Israel no matter what, right? And so Hamas and these other groups felt like there wasn't a heck of a lot to gain from trying to do this, you know, some sort of a major escalation, because they knew the US wouldn't even put out like an equivocal statement. They were arguing to me that the Biden administration is being too equivocal, and that they need to be more like Trump and be very, very clear that we're just going to side with Israel no matter what happens, no matter the casualties, no matter how long it takes. And that once you send that unambiguous message, that will lead Hamas and its patrons to kind of back down. And the last thing I want to quickly say is, look, Iran, I understand, obviously, you know, you can understand why they're playing a role and that they could benefit from this. But we're also seeing now increasing demands on Biden to stop trying to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. So as a result of this, so that actually could undermine Iran, because if Biden agrees to that and to not rejoin, that means economic sanctions continue to stay on Iran.
Yeah, I
Can
mean,
ask you something now?
to say on that though, a lot of the people in the Iranian regime don't want the nuclear deal. You see, it's only, and we've got elections coming up. And so you have, if you like, the Iranian right, for want of a better word, or the Iranian nationalists. They actually don't want a deal, so they're pushing against. So this actually benefits not only Iran in the more general sense, but the extremists within Iran who want to scupper they prefer sanctions to a deal.
That's right, because they can benefit from the black market and stuff like that. Absolutely, that is a very good point. And it is strange who ends up on what side. I mean, the Iranian hard right not wanting a deal, neither does Benjamin Netanyahu. So, go figure.
I was wondering now on the cost benefit issue. You were saying that the Biden administration were not really seeing any gains in this if they got involved, but they might lose a lot, wouldn't they? I mean, if they look weak, if they look not sort of being able to cope with the crisis, to be ahead of the curve.
I think that's a fair point. And I think that's why, I talked to activists and others who were telling them weeks ago, you guys need to step up your involvement in this and you need to go public. They were doing stuff behind the scenes, but the people, these observers, were saying they needed to do more because this was going to explode. And then it did. And now very much they look like they're catching up. The president himself. And yet the fact that they're not dispatching a higher level person, they haven't named an ambassador yet to Israel. I mean, there's just all this stuff that hasn't been done yet that you would think they would have had time to do and would have done. So to me, I just feel like, they're going to try to get through this somehow. But at the end of it, this doesn't mean that Joe Biden is going to suddenly decide he wants to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, I was struck by watching Martin Indyk give it to you earlier this week, where he said that Biden had been there with Obama the last time there'd been a really big push to get the two sides together. And Biden and Obama and everyone had concluded that there was just no prospect of this Israeli leadership and this Palestinian leadership doing a deal. So why bother? And he, I thought, made a strong point that Biden will get involved to try and calm things down, but they're not going to reinvest, as it were, in a peace process.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
There is an issue, though, and it's sort of the opposite of the Trump oysterism about all you need to support Israel and everything will be fine. The reality is that Israel and the United States and the Arab leaders, all who were willing to get into the Abraham Accords, all assumed that somehow you could ignore the Palestinians and the Palestinians would be okay with that somehow they would just be fine. And it seems to me that one of the things that is happening now is that the accumulation of ignoring the Palestinians has led them to say, we have nothing to lose. And when you feel you have nothing to lose, violence becomes a way to express that. I was visited Israel and the West Bank in 2017 and talking to a lot of young Palestinians, students, and their view was that everything that their class had betrayed them, and the only way to solve this problem was through violence. And you in some ways you're seeing that now, and that makes it more difficult to ignore it because the violence begets new violence, as we're seeing in the streets of Israel itself between Arab and Jewish citizens of the country. So inevitably, the Biden administration and frankly, the European Union and others are going to be forced, and the Arabs are going to be forced to take this seriously and find a way to resolve the issue. Philip, don't you you see?
Yeah, I do, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think everyone's going to be pushed. I also think, though, that the Israeli politicians are going to have to think again, because, as you said, the big change here has been the outbreaks of communal violence. And as all of us, when you go to Israel, it's felt safe. There's been the wall, that there've been these the only very occasional outbreaks of violence with Gaza, but it's basically felt safe. What's happening now is Israel itself doesn't feel so safe because of this communal violence. And I think that maybe changes some of the calculations among Israeli politicians. As long as, violence could be kept at a reasonable distance, it was okay, but this isn't okay. And so I just wonder whether, Israelis begin to rethink allowing, as what's been happening over the last 2 or 3 years is basically, those rejecting a two-state solution, the one state, the greater Israel adherents have been given their head. Well, this is where that gets you.
I think the test will be coming in the next hours or probably days on how much rallying behind the flag we will see. And from what I do see now, there isn't that much unity in analyzing the situation from the Israeli side. Coalition talks have not really collapsed yet. Netanyahu is not able to rally those loyal to him behind his cause. So it will spell out domestically very much in Israel, and this is where Philip is right. It's a generational thing, and it's now also a question of justice. And as much as I think it's condemnable on how much violence we see from the Hamas side, this huge sort of totally unproportional rocket volley thing, you cannot deny that the settlement issue and the East Jerusalem issue is a burning hot one, especially in terms of justice. And this will make it extremely difficult also for outside governments like the Europeans to keep a balance here. I was stricken that most European governments are pretty unified in condemning Hamas. I mean, this is pretty easy. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. But on the core issue on how to get control over the settlement movement and to stop this constant change in where the balance lies between Palestinian and Israeli interests, this hasn't been answered yet, and this will push us all to a new political dimension. I think this will be an issue in the foreign policy area for the months to come.
And I guess I think that's right, Stefan. And I guess Nahal, just bringing you here into it as well, that the U.S. has tried to straddle this issue of support for Israel and the settlement issue for a very long time. Yes, clearly the Trump folks straddle it by saying the settlement issue is not an issue. That is not where much of the political elite is, and yet the U.S. is not where the Europeans are. I mean, all the Europeans are clearly saying settlements are illegal. They've made a very strong case on both against Hamas, but also against the occupation in and of itself, which they call an occupation. That's not really yet part of the American body politics, though in the Democratic Party, one is seeing louder voices on that. And so how do you think that may play out in terms of where the Biden administration's emphasis is going to be going forward?
Yeah, look, I think that, when it comes to the Republican Party, they're very much lockstep with Israel, and they don't really say anything about settlements. The Democrats, as you're saying, are increasingly split on this, with the progressive left speaking out more about Israel's violence toward Palestinians, the settlement movement, that sort of thing. So the Biden administration does have to deal with a divided caucus, in a sense, when it comes to its own party. But does that mean that, it's going to condition military aid to Israel on some of this, as some lawmakers are calling for? I don't think so. I think that, ultimately they're going to calculate that this is not an issue that a lot of people vote on when it comes to midterms. And if they do vote on it, they're probably the type of people who aren't voting for Democrats anyway. They're probably like evangelical Christians who really, really, make this a burning issue for themselves. So like, does this mean there's going to be like significant changes in how we approach Israel in a material way other than a rhetorical one? No, and I don't see it changing too much. I think one of the things though that the Biden people are very frustrated by is when they hear these criticisms from the Trump people. The Biden retort is like, look, the reason that you see this emboldened settler movement in recent years, this ongoing efforts to push people out of East Jerusalem and Palestinians out of East Jerusalem and build more in the West Bank is precisely because Trump took a side, the Israeli side, and emboldened these, and also like increasing radicalization, like even among the Jewish community and within Israeli politics. So that is, they feel like they're dealing with just extremes, and it's very hard to pick and choose. But at the end of the day, like are they gonna like stop giving money to Israel? No, that's not ending.
Philip, I want to raise one last issue that you raised in your first intervention, which is the question of the Arab countries who move towards a peace process and peace with Israel through the Abraham Accords. They're caught, right, in some ways now, because they made the argument, and the UAE made it explicitly, that by being closer to Israel, they would have a more influence on Israel to deal with the Palestinians, and yet that doesn't seem to be the case right now. You're muted.
They're absolutely caught, because whatever the politicians in those countries think, if you watch Al Jazeera, the street in those countries, very, very pro-Palestinian. You've seen these huge demonstrations, and so whatever the leader of Qatar or the leader of the UAE, leaders of the UAE think, they have to watch their street. And I think now there was this sort of tentative discussion about, could Saudi Arabia come to some sort of accommodation? It always looked a bit distant, but that's all gone now. The pictures, the TV pictures of Israeli soldiers in one of Islam's holiest shrines does irreparable damage in terms of the Arab street. So I think that's gone. I think I don't think anyone's going to rip up the Accords, but I think they'll just sort of sit there now, and people will, as Stefan has been saying, people will realize that there is an Palestine-Israeli problem which hasn't gone away and can't be put to one side in any wider regional accommodation between Israel and the Arab states. That's the big thing. You can't have a regional accommodation without some movement on Israel-Palestine.
No.
I think, Philip, a lot of what you're saying makes sense, but I would add one thing, which is that the Hamas-Palestinian Authority divide also really frustrates a lot of people, who in the Arab world, and also a lot of Arab world leaders just really can't stand the Palestinian leadership, including the Palestinian Authority leadership. They say it's corrupt, they say it's old, they say it's out of touch. That's part of the problem here. Is like, it's not that they don't want to help the Palestinian people. It's like they just feel like the system currently does not give them like proper interlocutors that they can trust or who can pull off anything. And I'm sure that plenty of the Palestinian people feel very frustrated with their leadership as well. And so I think that until, that particular, there's some sort of a change, and there's a Palestinian leadership that garners more trust. I don't think you're going to see the support from the street translate into like serious political support or anything from other Arab countries for the Palestinians, because they just feel like they don't have a decent partner to work with.
I'm reminded by a question that former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once asked of his Home Secretary Rat Butler, and said, "What's the greatest challenge our administration faces?" And Butler said, "Events, my dear boy, events." And I can see whoever, Kamala Harris sitting in the Oval Office and say, what's our greatest challenge? And Biden saying, events in the Middle East like this. It's not going to go away. It is a challenge. And for the United States, a country that wants to, under Biden, retake a global leadership role and the seat at the head of the table, to quote President Biden, this is a challenge that is going to be very hard to ignore for sure. The good news is, the bad news is that the conflict is likely to continue for many weeks and months, and we will come back to the issue at a future World Review. But let's change to another events story, Philip, which is the elections, local elections in this case in the UK, which had some very strong messages, both for the government and the opposition in Westminster, but perhaps equally importantly for how people in the constituent parts of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland feel about the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. How do you read the election outcome?
Well, I mean, there were two stories to these elections. The first stories, which a lot of the British media went with, was that in England, the biggest part of the UK, the results for the Conservatives were really good. They basically hammered the Labour opposition in places where Labour has traditionally been strong. If you like, a rather Trumpian populist incursion or further incursion into Labour heartlands, and they're playing still there on the Brexit vote in those heartlands, on the fact that Johnson, for all his flaws as a prime minister and a leader and all the troubles he gets, makes connections with people. People forgive him things. I mean, there are all sorts of potential scandals about, money, spent on redecorating his apartment. But with Johnson, as with Trump, these things, yeah, but he's okay. We'll forget about that. We can forgive him that. So on the one hand, you could say this is a triumph for Boris Johnson. The Conservatives haven't been as strong in England since Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. On the other hand, you look to Scotland and the Scottish nationalists who have been pressing for independence, who vigorously opposed Brexit, leaving the European Union, and Scotland also opposed leaving the European Union. They did really well, and they're back in government in the Scottish Parliament with a commitment to force a referendum on independence. Now, there's a standoff at the moment where they say, Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, is saying we must have a referendum in the next 2 or 3 years. Johnson is saying constitutionally I can block that, and I'm gonna block that. Most people think he can't block it. In the end, that if the people of Scotland want to give their opinion on whether they want to stay in a union, a 300-odd year union, they will be able to decide. So we see, I think that we're one step closer, I think, to that fracture in the union, which could, within the next 5 years or so, see Scotland leave the union. And then across in Northern Ireland, where they didn't actually have elections, but we've got this looming crisis about how the Brexit settlement works for Northern Ireland. And it's very complicated, but in effect, it's created a new customs border between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland. And that has the unionists in uproar and the government seriously at odds with Brussels. That crisis is growing, and it's beginning to look like it could threaten the Good Friday, the Belfast Peace Agreement, which brought together the nationalist and unionist parties. And that looks very dangerous. I mean, we were talking about, how you can't leave these little problems to fester in Israel-Palestine. Well, on a much, much smaller scale, it's the same in Northern Ireland. You get these small communal resentments and battles, and they can flare up, and that's the danger. And so we've now got to the stage, and I noticed this week, where 25 members of Congress are calling for Joe Biden to step in. I think rightly so. Bill Clinton had a big part in helping to negotiate the Belfast Agreement. And what these Congress members are saying is, look, they need a mediator. You need someone to go in there and sit, as it were, between the EU, Britain, and the unionists and nationalists, and restore trust, because what's happened is that trust has evaporated. Largely, I would say, because the British government has reneged on some of the agreements it made with the EU and has misled many of the unionists in Northern Ireland. So the picture is short term, Boris Johnson riding high. Look a little bit further out. How long is Britain going to hold together?
Stefan, when seen from across the channel, is what's happening on the union issue, as opposed to Boris Johnson's political victory on the question of the union and its future. Is that of direct relevance to the European Union? Does Europe care what's happening here, given that the UK is no longer a member of the European Union?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the EU is still deeply involved, and well, there is also a little bit of Schadenfreude in it, but I think this is a very superficial and dangerous feeling, because the implications of that crisis will be felt in Europe all over the place. Europe cannot afford to have another unstable region in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in its neighborhood. The same is true with Scotland. I mean, if Scotland decides to break free from England, from the Union, then the next step would be the application for membership in the European Union. That would pose a huge problem to the EU, because that would stipulate similar demands and interests, let's say, from the Catalonians in Spain and other regions which want to have their independence and separation from their nation state. Now, for me, the striking feature in all of this is how badly thought through all those broader implications of Brexit had been in the decision in 2016. And as Philip said, how short-sighted Johnson even now acts. I mean, it would have been so easy for him to send much more positive and unifying signals towards Scotland and towards the Irish community, which I still do not see. And I don't know actually how they want to escape that quagmire, especially in Northern Ireland, where tiny bits can lead to a flare-up of violence again. And we've seen that prior to the death of Prince Philip. There were nightly protests and cars burning, and this will come back.
Nahal, seen from Washington, particularly from the White House, Joe Biden is very proud of his Irish heritage. He quotes more Irish poets than anyone else outside of Ireland as a matter of thinking, and he's also been very clear where he stands on the issue of Brexit writ large. What's the reaction been in Washington on the Northern Ireland piece, and also on the issue of Scotland, another part where lots of people of Scottish heritage are running around in the United States as well?
From what I'm hearing, and look, I haven't been talking to every single person on this particular topic. It's not my strength. But, whenever I bring up stuff like this to the people I'm talking to, even to the people who are dealing with transatlantic issues, things like that, there's a real frustration about stuff like this. Like, obviously, they will probably appoint an envoy. They will stay involved, that sort of thing. They're not going to they believe in this whole allies and partners thing. So they really, really want to, live up to that promise. But I think they also really would like Europe and Britain and to focus on what they see as the real issue, which is China, and unifying against China and dealing with major issues like climate change, things like that. And this type of thing, I think, really frustrates some folks because they feel like it's like taking your eye off the ball. But yeah.
Philip, I mean, in a very fair comment, I think Nahal's right. I hear the same thing. let's get on with the real issues here. There's some sense that London, of course, would like to get on with the real, quote, and I put real in quotation marks because the future of the Union is hardly unreal, or indeed the 400-year conflict inside Ireland is hardly unreal. But the big issues of dealing with China and dealing with the world, the British Royal Fleet is about to sail to the Pacific. Is there a sense that we, the elections are over, now we can move on, and that these issues can be safely ignored?
But this is the Johnson approach to things. Like, we can just sort of brush aside, there is this problem, but it's too difficult, so let's just brush it aside and do something else. I mean, let's be clear, the last thing the British government wants is for Biden to appoint an envoy. They've been lobbying really very hard against it, particularly an envoy ahead of the G7 meeting, because they fear, and I think rightly, that if you bring in an outsider, that outsider will say, well, Britain has to be held to the commitments it made to the EU. And that is what Johnson is trying to avoid. Johnson is saying, I didn't make those commitments, but then he's shown the tape, or the document. It is very Trumpian, I didn't say that. Well, here's the videotape when you said it, so the Brits, but I think that this is getting quite dangerous now. I mean, we're not on the edge of violence in Northern Ireland, but we're going down that path. And what a US mediator could do is basically put everyone on their mark to stick with the agreements that they've made and to restore the trust. And if you like, give a guarantee that Washington will stand behind. Now, let's be clear too, there are American politics in this. There are quite a lot of these people in Congress who have a clear interest, who have very substantial Irish diasporas in their congressional districts. So, I don't think Biden, whatever we all agree, China is what matters, but I don't think this is politically something that Biden can ignore either.
And Stefan, jump in here. Clearly the EU would like to get beyond Brexit too, and everything else, and yet you had a French UK way to a standoff, naval standoff over fishery, and of course the whole trade issue with Northern Ireland. How is the EU going to come in and see if they can try to help and solve this?
Well, the EU will take it step by step, mostly Northern Ireland now. There are trade talks. There might be a solution sort of on a technical level. It's still hoped for. You always have the shots now, British side demanding a more robust sort of approach, just take your chances and trust. There still needs to be sorted out. It will come back. And I think this would be the message to the Biden administration and to sort of the American audience. Sort of European unity is not a given. It's a pretty tough thing to keep this continent together. And now even that Britain has left the Union, the European Union, to find sort of strategic unity versus broader challenges like China or Russia. Demands that we also deal with nitty-gritty issues. And I guess if there's one lesson from the Israeli-Palestinian flare this week, it is that better watch the small things.
Well, we're going to be watching the small things for the next few weeks because small things can become really big things, as Stefan has emphasized, and the consequences that may be local can reverberate nationally, regionally, and then globally. And it does certainly in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, in the conflict between Republicans and Unionists in Northern Ireland, and in so many other places. And it means that if you want to be part of the world, you have to figure out how to engage it. We'll discuss all of this in the weeks to come. But for now, I think I want to thank Philip Stevens, Nahal Toosi, and Stefan Kornelius for highlighting so many of the complicated issues, making all of us a little wiser about what is happening in the world and how we need to take account of what is happening and why it matters. So I really appreciate all of your insights. As always, they're terrific. Thank you so much for joining us this week. for World Review, and we'll be back next Friday for another discussion of news from around the world. In the meantime, a great weekend to all of you and to our listeners and watchers from wherever they are. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Thanks.